Something is shifting in you right now, not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and explain to someone who asked, but something that has been building for a long time, quietly, below the surface of your ordinary days, has reached a point where it can no longer be ignored. You are tired, not the tiredness that sleep fixes. The specific, accumulated tiredness of someone who has been giving from a reservoir that was never designed to be drawn from without replenishment, who has been reading everyone else's emotional states so accurately, so automatically, so far in advance of those people's awareness of their own states, that the capacity has stopped feeling like a gift. It has started feeling like a sentence, and alongside the tiredness, something else. Something that does not have a comfortable name in the vocabulary that was handed to you when you were taught what kind of person to be. A clarity, a cold, specific, increasingly undeniable clarity about the exact structure of certain relationships, about who actually shows up and who performs showing up, about who asks how you are because they want to know and who asks how you are as an opening to tell you how they are, about who your sensitivity has been serving, and about the considerable distance between that answer. Carl Jung spent decades studying the psychology of people who feel everything, and what he observed, documented across hundreds of cases, examined through the lens of a theoretical framework that remains one of the most rigorous accounts of human psychological development ever produced, was not what the culture around sensitivity tends to say about it. He did not see sensitivity as a limitation to be managed. He saw it as a capacity that had been profoundly misallocated, and he believed, with the specific conviction of someone who had watched the pattern resolve itself too many times to doubt the outcome, that the misallocation eventually corrects. Not through dramatic intervention, through the natural pressure of a life that has been organized around others for long enough that the self finally, irreversibly, begins insisting on its own existence. This is that moment. To understand what Jung was describing, you have to begin with what the empath's sensitivity actually is at the psychological level. Not what it feels like, what it is. Most accounts of empathic sensitivity treat it as primarily emotional, as the capacity to feel what others feel, to be moved by their experience, to register their pain as something close to personal. And this is real. It is part of what empathic sensitivity consists of, but it is not the whole of it. And the part that is not usually described is the part that becomes most significant in the context of what Jung was observing. Empathic sensitivity is also perceptual. It is the capacity to process interpersonal information at a level of granularity that most people simply do not have access to. The micro-expressions that betray a contradiction between what someone is saying and what they are experiencing. The quality of a pause before an answer that tells you something about what was considered and then decided against. The specific way someone's energy shifts when the topic moves into territory that is genuinely threatening to them rather than merely inconvenient. The pattern across interactions that no single interaction would reveal, but that, observed across time, tells you something precise about the structure of what is actually operating beneath the presented surface. This is perceptual intelligence, and it is remarkable. The problem Jung identified was not with the intelligence itself, it was with how it had been deployed. For most empaths, this extraordinary perceptual capacity had been directed almost entirely outward, toward the management of other people's states, toward the anticipation of other people's needs, toward the absorption of other people's difficulty, so that it would not have to become anyone else's problem. The capacity had been converted, through years of conditioning, into a service. And services have a very specific relationship to the people who use them. They are appreciated when functioning, and not particularly noticed when functioning well. The conditioning that produced this deployment has a specific history, and it begins, in most cases, earlier than the person can clearly remember. Somewhere in the environment of childhood, the empath learned something that was never explicitly taught. That the specific quality of attention their sensitivity allowed them to provide, the quality of being genuinely seen, genuinely understood, genuinely held in someone's awareness, in a way that most people rarely experience from others, was valuable. Profoundly, consistently, urgently valuable. To the people around them. And that its provision produced something the child needed: warmth, approval, the confirmation of belonging, the specific sense that their presence was not merely tolerated, but genuinely wanted. This learning was not wrong exactly. The warmth was real. The approval was genuine. The belonging was actual. But it was conditional in a way that was never stated, and therefore never examined. The warmth arrived in response to a specific kind of presence, the one that was oriented entirely outward, that asked nothing, that required nothing, that absorbed everything. And so the empath learned, in the way that all fundamental learning occurs, not through instruction, but through the repeated experience of what produces warmth and what produces its absence, to be that specific kind of presence. Consistently, automatically, before the conscious mind had any say in the matter. By the time they were old enough to examine the pattern was already structural, already the way they moved through every relationship, already what felt like simply who they were. What accumulated in the shadow while this pattern ran is what makes the current moment so significant, because the empath was not simply absorbing and transmuting everyone else's experience without consequence to their own. Something was being registered. Something was being cataloged, not consciously, not with any intention of eventual use, but the psyche, which is a more thorough and more accurate recorder than the conscious mind, was keeping records. Every manipulation encountered, every dynamic where care was met with exploitation, every relationship where the distribution of emotional labor was so profoundly asymmetrical that the asymmetry had its own weight. Every moment where the empath's intuition said something clearly and the empath's conditioning immediately overrode it. All of this went somewhere, not into oblivion, into the shadow, into the part of the psyche that cannot be directly accessed through conscious review, but that influences, with increasing force over time, the quality of the person's engagement with their own life. Jung understood the shadow, not as a dark or malevolent region, as the collection of everything that could not be integrated into the conscious identity. Everything the persona required to be excluded, and for the empath, whose persona had been organized around selflessness, availability, and the consistent prioritization of others, the shadow contained something specific. The parts of themselves that were not organized around others at all. The parts that had preferences, that had needs, that had limits, that had the capacity to say no without the infrastructure of apology that the persona required. That had the ability to see clearly what was happening in a dynamic and act on that clarity, rather than absorbing it and converting it into material for continued management of the other person's comfort. These parts were not evil. They were not the shadow in the dramatic sense. They were simply the aspects of a full human person that the conditioning had deemed incompatible with the role that produced belonging. And they had been accumulating, in exile, for years. Jung identified something he called enantiodromia, the principle by which anything that reaches its extreme begins moving toward its opposite. He observed this in individuals, in historical periods, in cultural movements. He believed it was as reliable as physical law, and he applied it specifically to the kind of psychological configuration this video is describing. The person who has been entirely organized around others for long enough, who has extended the outward deployment of their sensitivity to the point where the inner life has been effectively evacuated, who has given and absorbed and managed and accommodated past the point where the role is sustainable. That person, Jung believed, does not simply continue indefinitely until something external breaks them. The psyche itself intervenes, not through breakdown, through reversal, through the activation of everything that has been in exile, the anger that was buried because anger was incompatible with the role, the preferences that were suppressed because the role had no room for them, the limits that were denied because limits felt like a betrayal of the people who had come to depend on their absence. The clarity that was available all along but was consistently overridden because acting on it would have disrupted arrangements that the conditioning said were necessary to maintain. All of this begins to surface, not explosively, quietly, with a quality of calm that is more unsettling to the people around the empath than anger would have been. Because anger can be managed, clarity cannot. What is actually happening in the empath whose comeback is beginning is not, as it is sometimes framed, the development of hardness, the acquisition of coldness as a protective response to having been too warm for too long. That framing misses what is actually occurring. What is actually occurring is integration. The shadow material that has been in exile, the parts of the self that could not be included in the identity organized around selfless service, is being brought into conscious relationship with the parts that were present all along. The sensitivity is not diminishing. The capacity to feel what others feel, to read the room, to perceive what is not being said, to understand the emotional architecture of an interaction at a level most people never access. None of that is going anywhere. It is being joined by its counterpart. The part that can feel all of that and choose how to respond to it, rather than being compelled by it. The empath who has not yet integrated this material is driven by their sensitivity. They feel the other person's need, and the feeling produces an automatic response that bypasses any consultation with their own state. The empath who is integrating it is informed by their sensitivity. They feel the other person's need, and the feeling becomes information that they consider alongside their own state. And from that consideration, they make a choice, not a compelled response, a genuine choice. This is the difference between sensitivity as a form of unconscious servitude and sensitivity as a form of conscious intelligence. And it is the difference that the comeback represents. The people around the empath notice this change before they can name it. Something is different. The usual responses are not arriving on the usual schedule. The automatic absorption that could be counted on. The smoothing over. The reframing of the dynamic in terms most favorable to the person who benefited from it. The patience that had no apparent limit, is behaving differently. It is still present in some form, but it is no longer automatic. There is something between the stimulus and the response now, a pause that was not there before. And in that pause, something is being considered, something that was not previously part of the calculation. The empath's own experience of the interaction, their own assessment of what is actually happening, their own reading, which has been accurate all along, which was always more accurate than what they were allowing to reach consciousness, of what this dynamic actually is, and what it costs, and whether the cost is one they are willing to continue paying. For people who benefited from the empath's unconscious availability, this pause is deeply unsettling, not because it represents cruelty, because it represents something that was not previously available in the dynamic, an actual person, with their own interior, their own assessment, their own capacity to decide. The pause is where everything changes, not the dramatic confrontation, not the announced decision, not the boundary stated in the language that self-help frameworks provide for stating boundaries. The pause, the half-second in which something that used to move automatically from perception to response is interrupted. And in that interruption, the self, the actual self, not the persona organized around service, has room to exist. This is the beginning of what Jung meant by individuation. Not the achievement of some completed, finally arrived at version of the self. The ongoing, incremental process of becoming someone whose responses arise from their actual interior, rather than from the conditioned reflexes of a role that was assumed before the person had any say in what role they would assume. For the empath, this process has a specific texture, because what is being integrated is not simply shadow material in the abstract. It is the accumulated record of a lifetime of accurate perception that was consistently overridden. Every moment, the intuition signaled something clearly, and the conditioning immediately converted that signal into a more acceptable form. Every interaction where the empath knew, before the conscious mind would allow the knowledge, what was actually happening, and chose, or was chosen by the conditioning, to act as though they did not. That knowledge did not evaporate. It was stored. And what the integration process makes available is access to it. The accumulated data of years of observing human behavior from the specific vantage point of someone whose sensitivity had been directed entirely toward others, an archive of pattern recognition that most people will never develop, because developing it required a level of sustained attention to the emotional interior of other people that only the specific psychology of the empath produces. What the empath discovers, as this integration proceeds, is that the perceptual capacity they always had is now available for a different purpose. It was always directed outward, toward others, toward their states, their needs, their comfort, their management. Now it turns, for the first time with any consistency, inward. And what it finds there is clarifying in ways that are difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced the specific quality of finally seeing your own life clearly after years of being primarily occupied with everyone else's. You begin to see the structures, the arrangements that were never stated but that governed everything, the implicit contracts that required specific things from you while offering specific things in return, and the degree to which the terms of those contracts were set without your participation, not through anyone's malice necessarily. Not always through deliberate exploitation, simply through the ordinary operation of systems that will always expand to fill the available capacity. And your capacity had been available, fully, consistently, without apparent limit. The relationships that absorbed it were not required to negotiate for it. It simply arrived, reliably, because the conditioning that produced it had been doing so for so long that the arrival had stopped being experienced as a choice. By anyone, including you. The comeback does not begin with a confrontation. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what is actually happening. The cultural narrative around this kind of transformation tends to frame it as the moment the quiet person finally speaks, the moment the accommodating person finally says the thing they have been holding for years, the cathartic expression of everything that was suppressed. Jung's observation was more precise and less dramatic than this. He noticed that the most significant change did not occur in expression. It occurred in perception, specifically in the withdrawal of projections. For years, the empath had been projecting onto the people around them, not projecting in the negative sense of attributing their own flaws to others. Projecting in the specific sense of placing onto others qualities those others did not actually possess. Projecting potential. Projecting the capacity for reciprocity that the relationship did not actually contain. Projecting the good faith that the interaction did not actually carry. Projecting the depth of connection that was present on one side of the relationship, but not on both. This projection was not naive exactly. It was a specific psychological operation, a way of making the relationship sustainable by seeing it as something other than what it was. Because what it was, seen clearly, was not something the empath could participate in without experiencing a level of distress that the conditioning said was not appropriate to feel. So the projection filled the gap, made the relationship appear more equal, made the other person appear more capable of genuine connection, made the dynamic appear more mutual than it was, and allowed the empath to continue. The comeback begins when the projections are withdrawn, when the empath looks at the relationship without the supplementary material they have been adding to make it appear adequate, and sees what is actually there. Not what was hoped for, not what could theoretically be there if the other person chose to develop in particular ways. What is actually, presently, demonstrably there, and makes a decision based on that seeing rather than on the projection that was making the gap appear smaller than it is. This withdrawal of projections produces something that looks from the outside like indifference, but is something quite different. Indifference is the absence of feeling. What the empath develops through this process is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of accurate assessment alongside the feeling. They still feel. They may feel more fully than they did before, because the suppression that was keeping the shadow material in exile was also keeping the full range of emotional experience partially inaccessible. As the shadow integrates, the emotional range becomes more complete, more genuinely available, but it is no longer the feeling alone that determines the response. The feeling is information, considered alongside other information, and from that consideration, a response arises that reflects the full complexity of what is actually present. Not the managed, edited, optimized for others' comfort version, the actual response, which is sometimes quieter than what came before, sometimes more direct, sometimes involves a willingness to allow a dynamic to end that the previous version would have spent enormous energy trying to maintain. Not because ending it is pleasant, because continuing it requires the suppression of an accurate perception that the empath is no longer willing to suppress. The specific quality of the empath's perceptual intelligence becomes available to them in an entirely new way during this period. Because for the first time, it is not primarily in the service of managing situations for others. It is available for the empath's own navigation. And what this intelligence reveals, when applied to the empath's own life, rather than to the emotional states of the people around them, is simultaneously obvious and astonishing. Obvious because it was always available, always producing the signals, always registering the accurate reading of the situation. Astonishing, because the conditioning was so thorough that the signals had been reliably intercepted before they could inform any decision. You knew. You knew which relationships were organized around your consistent availability and would not survive its reduction. You knew which dynamics required your suppression of your own accurate assessment to function. You knew which people were present when you were useful and absent when you were not. You knew which conversations left you depleted before they ended. You knew, in the specific way that embodied knowledge operates, that things were not reciprocal in the way that the presented surface suggested they were. You knew all of this, and you overrode the knowing. Not once, not occasionally, systematically, consistently, in service of the conditioning that said the knowing was less important than the maintenance of the connection. What the integration process does is restore the knowing to its appropriate authority, not above everything else, not as an infallible guide that supersedes all other considerations, but as genuine input into decisions that affect your actual life, rather than as a signal to be immediately suppressed in the interest of everyone else's comfort. The people who find the changed empath most unsettling are not, in most cases, the people who wished them harm. They are the people who were most thoroughly organized around the empath's availability, who needed the consistent provision of the empath's perceptual and emotional intelligence for their own functioning, who had, over years of reliable supply, built their equilibrium on the assumption of that supply's continuity. These people do not experience the empath's integration as the empath becoming more fully themselves. They experience it as the empath becoming less themselves, less the self they knew, less the self that occupied the role in the system. They ask, with genuine bewilderment, what happened? What changed? Why the person they relied on seems to be operating from a different set of priorities? Why the usual tactics for restoring the previous dynamic no longer produce the expected results? The guilt trip that previously produced immediate accommodation now produces a quiet observation. The manufactured crisis that previously generated the empath's full mobilization now generates a calm inquiry about what the other person plans to do about it. The withdrawal of warmth that previously produced anxious attempts to restore connection now produces a degree of equanimity that the other person finds more disturbing than the old anxiety was. Because the anxiety confirmed that the connection mattered, the equanimity suggests that the terms of the connection have changed, and that the new terms do not include the empath's participation in dynamics that require them to suppress their own accurate perception of what is happening. Jung wrote about the individuated person with a precision that is worth staying close to, because the cultural conversation around this kind of transformation tends to romanticize it in ways that lose the specific quality he was describing. The individuated person is not invulnerable. They still feel. They still experience loss, difficulty, the ordinary pain of being human in a world that is genuinely complex and genuinely difficult. What changes is not the emotional range. What changes is the relationship between what is felt and what is expressed, acted upon, allowed to determine behavior. The individuated empath can be moved by someone's pain without being compelled to fix it, can feel the pull of a familiar dynamic without being drawn back into it, can recognize the manipulation in an interaction without being required to either expose it or absorb it, can simply, and this is the capacity that took the longest to develop, decline. Without elaborate justification, without the 3-paragraph explanation that was previously required to make a refusal feel defensible, without the guilt that previously made every act of self-prioritization feel like a moral failure. Simply decline, because what is being offered does not match what is needed or wanted. And that is, it turns out, sufficient reason. The comeback is not a return to a previous state. This is something worth being clear about. There is no previous state to return to. The person before the conditioning had not yet developed the perceptual intelligence that the conditioning, for all its cost, produced. The suffering was not wasted. The years of absorbing and managing and keeping the peace and suppressing the accurate reading of what was happening were not simply years of loss. They were years of development, of a specific and remarkable capacity being honed under conditions that were not pleasant, but that produced something real. The empath who has moved through this process does not discard the sensitivity. They do not abandon the capacity for genuine connection, for feeling what others feel, for understanding emotional dynamics at a level that most people cannot access. They integrate it. Add to it the counterpart that was always supposed to accompany it, but that the conditioning excluded. The discernment, the capacity to assess, the ability to decide, based on the accurate reading that was always available, where the sensitivity will be directed, and where it will not. This is not coldness, it is completion. The coin with both sides, the battery with both charges, the person who contains the full range of what a human being contains, rather than the carefully selected half that was deemed compatible with being loved. What the comeback produces in the empath's actual life is quieter than the word comeback suggests. It does not look like a victory parade. It does not produce the dramatic vindication that the years of difficulty might seem to call for. It looks like a Tuesday morning, where a request arrives that would previously have generated an automatic yes, and instead there is a pause. And in the pause, a genuine question. Do I actually want to do this? Is this something that arises from my own genuine desire to contribute, to help, to be present for this person? Or is this something that arises from the conditioned reflex that says yes before the question is fully formed? And based on the answer to that question, which is now actually consulted rather than bypassed, a response is generated. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes something more complex than either, but always, now, arising from an actual consideration of the actual person who is being asked, rather than from the automatic operation of a system that had been running so long it had stopped announcing itself as a system at all. This is the comeback, not the dramatic reversal, the quiet, incremental, irreversible restoration of a self that was always present. That survived the years of being organized around everyone else's needs by going underground. That kept its own records, maintained its own knowing, waited, with whatever patience underground things have, for the conditions that would make its emergence possible. Those conditions are now present. The emergence is already underway, and what is emerging is not softer than what came before, not harder either, more genuinely itself than it has ever been allowed to be, which is, in Jung's understanding, precisely what the process was always moving toward. From the beginning, even when the beginning looked like nothing but loss. If something in this reached a specific and recognizable place in you, leave one word in the comments that describes what is finally beginning to emerge, because naming it is how it knows it is safe to surface.